She was 22 years old and she had been told to leave by the end of the season. There was no shouting. There was no cruelty in it. There was only a guest room that would need to become a nursery by November and a sister-in-law who had practiced the sentence 3 times in her head before she said it out loud, and an older brother who had looked at the pattern on the kitchen tablecloth the whole time she was speaking. Cora Whitfield walked out of that kitchen with $10 in the front pocket of her canvas work jacket and a folded linen map in the inside pocket and a keyring in her hand that she had earned in a building in Hagerstown that smelled of floor polish and old paper. The keyring held 3 iron keys of different sizes. The largest one was for a door that had not been opened in over a century. The middle one was for a room that nobody in the county government could describe to her with any confidence. The smallest one was for a coal cellar she had not yet seen. She walked the 1.5 miles from the truck drop-off at the Little Pool boat ramp along the towpath of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal in western Maryland, and the Potomac River moved past her on the right, and the dry canal bed ran along her left, and the sycamores and river birch along the berm stood in the late April afternoon light, the way they had been standing for 180 years. She did not walk fast. She was not in a hurry. The path knew her. The path had known her since she was 4 years old. And when she came around the long, slow bend below Round Top Hill and saw the cut limestone walls of Lock 53 rising out of the towpath, the way a vertebra rises out of a riverbed, she stopped. She did not cry. She did not smile. She stood there on the packed dirt for a long moment, and she looked at the small stone cottage set back 30 feet from the lock chamber on the berm side, and she looked at the heavy oak door that had been sealed with an iron hasp since 1971, and she looked at the rusted gate hardware that had not been turned since the morning of March the 29th, 1924. And she said out loud to the cottage and the lock and the river and the 100 years of silence standing between her and all of it, "All right, I'm here." The canal had been dead for 102 years, and Cora Whitfield had just become its newest tenant. Hancock, Maryland is a narrow town. It sits in the thinnest part of the state, a ribbon of pavement and frame houses and churches pressed between the Potomac River on one side and the long green back of Tonolaway Ridge on the other. A man standing in the middle of Main Street can see water in one direction and mountain in the other, and it has been that way for 200 years, and it will probably be that way for 200 more. Cora had been born in a rented house on the east end of town, in a room with a radiator that knocked all winter, to a mother named Ruth Whitfield, who worked as a home health aide, and to a father who drove long-haul freight on I-70 and then on I-81, and then on whatever route kept him pointed away from the house he had come home from one too many times. He left when Cora was 2. Her mother did not speak of him after that, and Cora learned early not to ask. Her mother raised her and her older brother Clayton alone in the particular way that home health aides in small Potomac Valley towns raise their children alone, which is to say competently and without sentiment, and with an iron discipline about bedtimes. Ruth did not drink. Ruth did not complain. Ruth went to her jobs and came home and fed her children and fell asleep on the couch most nights with a paperback mystery novel on her chest and the television tuned to the local news. But Cora had Walter. Walter Whitfield was Ruth's father. He had been born in 1920 in a tenant farmer's cabin on the south end of Tonolaway Ridge, and his own father had been a canal boatman on the Chesapeake and Ohio, the last generation of men who made their living pulling Cumberland coal down the long stone ditch to Georgetown behind a team of mules. Walter had been 3 years old the winter the canal was still running. He had been 4 when the flood of 1924 came down the Potomac on a Saturday morning in late March and destroyed the locks and the aqueducts and the towpath and the canal company's payroll and every mule-drawn future that had been waiting for a boy like him. Walter remembered it. He remembered standing on the porch of the tenant cabin with his mother and watching the brown water rise over the road. He remembered that his father had not come home for 3 days. The canal never ran again after that morning, but it did not go away. It lay there in the valley like a long scar that had healed into a walking trail and the cut limestone of its 74 locks stood in the woods from Georgetown to Cumberland, the way old cathedral walls stand in the English countryside, and the Lockmaster's cottages beside each lock were boarded up one by one across the 20th century, and the National Park Service took over what remained in 1971 and sealed what it could not maintain. Walter grew up with the canal in his back pocket. He became a carpenter and small boat builder, and he worked on the Potomac his whole life. And he told stories about the canal the way certain old men in certain river towns tell stories about a thing that ended before most of the people listening were born. Not as history, as texture, as a specific weather that had once existed and was now gone, and that only he and the grandchild he was walking with could still feel on the back of the neck. He started walking Cora to Lock 53, the spring she turned 4. The walk was a mile and a half each way. Walter did not walk fast. He walked at a 4-year-old's pace, and he talked the whole way. And what he talked about was the canal, and what the canal had been, and who had worked it, and how the stones had been cut, and which ones were Antietam quartzite, and which ones were Tonallaway limestone, and which ones had come from a quarry on the Virginia side of the river and been hauled across on flat-bottom barges in the summer of 1838. He told her about the stonemason, too, a German immigrant named Gottlieb Hermann Kaspari, who had laid the stone for 11 locks between Hancock and Cumberland across 4 years in the late 1830s, and who had, according to Walter's father, carved his initials GHC into the back of a single stone in each of the 11 locks he had built. The initials could only be seen from inside the chamber when the water was drained. Walter had looked for them at Lock 53 as a boy in the dry summers and had never found them. Cora looked for them every evening for 3 years of her childhood and never found them either. But the looking had taught her something more valuable than the finding. It had taught her to read stone, to notice the grain of limestone, to feel with her fingertips whether the mortar was original or patched old or new, laid with care or laid in haste. Walter had not known when he started her looking for Kaspari's initials that he was teaching her to see. He had thought he was telling her a story. The thing about the best teachers is that they do not always know what they are teaching. He told her about his father's boat, a 70-foot wooden barge named the Esther Lee after Walter's mother. It had carried 8 to 12 tons of coal per run. 5 days down to Georgetown, 6 days back. Mule teams changed out every 12 miles at relay barns along the towpath. He told her about the mules, the patient animals who walked the path at 2 miles an hour, pulling the boat by a cotton tow rope thicker than a man's wrist. He told her about the lock tenders, the men and women, and he was careful to say women too, because there had been more of them than people remembered, who lived in the small limestone houses beside each lock and opened the gates at any hour of the day or night for any boat that came through, because the canal did not keep business hours, and a lockmaster who slept through a boat's approach was a lockmaster who did not hold his post long. He knew every lock, all 74 of them from Georgetown to Cumberland. He knew them by number and by name, and by the name of the lockmaster who had held each one in 1920 when he was born. He knew which locks had clean-cut stone and which ones had weathering cracks and which ones had been repaired in the 1890s after the flood of 1889 and which ones still had their original 1838 mortar intact in places along the waterline. And he knew Lock 53 better than any of them because Lock 53 was theirs. Lock 53 was the lock nearest to Hancock. Lock 53 was the lock Walter had been taken to by his own father as a small boy. Lock 53 was the lock the last lockmaster, a man named Gideon Reinhardt, had operated from 1882 until the morning of the flood. Walter said the name Gideon Reinhardt the way a Methodist says the name of an apostle. Gideon Reinhardt had been 62 years old on the morning of the flood. He had lived in the stone cottage beside Lock 53 for 42 years. He had opened and closed the lock gates by Walter's father's best estimate 18,000 times across those 42 years. And he had died 7 years later in 1931, in a farmhouse belonging to a nephew over in Clear Spring, and he had never once in those 7 years gone back to the lock or the cottage or the gate room. Walter had known all of this by the time he was 6 because his own father had known it and his own father had told him, and it had come down through the family the way the linen map had come down, folded and creased and carried in the inside pocket of a canvas work jacket by each generation that held it. The map was hand-drawn in India ink on a heavy linen sheet. It showed every lock, every aqueduct, every feeder, dam, every turning basin from mile 0 in Georgetown to mile 184 at Cumberland. It had belonged to Walter's father, whose name was Claude Whitfield. He had carried it in the cabin of the Esther Lee from 1905 until the morning of the flood. He had walked out of the wrecked cabin on the Sunday after the flood with the map folded inside his shirt, and he had kept it on the wall of every house he had lived in for the rest of his life. And when he died, Walter took it down and put it on his own wall. And when Walter died, Ruth took it down. And when Ruth died, Cora took it down. And Cora had carried it in the inside pocket of her jacket every day for the 3 years since. Walter showed Cora how to read stone the way other grandfathers showed their grandchildren how to read a newspaper. He showed her the way a good mason cut the face of a limestone block so that the grain ran horizontally and the frost of 100 winters could not split the face off the wall. He showed her the difference between original mortar and repair mortar, the original sandy and gray and coarse to the fingertip, the repair smoother and slightly blue and laid with the sharper edge that came from a 20th century trowel. He showed her how to tell whether a gate hinge had been forged from wrought iron or cast iron by the sound it made when you tapped it with a penny. He showed her on a Saturday afternoon in late September of her 9th year, a thing he had never shown anyone else. He walked her around to the riverside of the Lockmaster's cottage at Lock 53, and he pointed at a narrow door set into the foundation at basement level on the downstream end, a door that was not visible from the towpath or the lock chamber, a door that Cora, who had walked past the cottage hundreds of times, had never noticed. "That's the gate room," Walter said. "The lockmaster's office. The iron wheel is in there. That's where Gideon Reinhardt opened the gates from inside the house when the weather was bad enough that he didn't want to walk out to the lock. My father saw him do it once in a February ice storm in 1919. My father's boat was the only boat moving on the canal that day. Gideon Reinhardt opened Lock 53 for him from inside this room, and my father said the mechanism turning inside the stone wall was the most beautiful piece of engineering he had ever seen on the canal." Cora had asked how he knew about it if nobody had been inside since 1924. "Because my father told me," Walter said, "and because I know Cora, I know." He did not say more than that. He did not say, and Cora did not yet know, to ask that he himself had once been inside. That in 1978, the National Park Service had opened the cottage for a single afternoon to a preservation team out of Cumberland, and that Walter had walked down from Hancock that morning and talked his way inside on the strength of his father's name and his own knowledge of the old hardware, and that he had stood in the gate room for 22 minutes and had memorized as much of the mechanism as a carpenter's eye could hold in 22 minutes. He had filed an application to purchase the cottage from the Park Service the following week. The application had been denied. He had never spoken of it, not to his daughter, not to his granddaughter, not to anyone. But that is a story for later in this account. That story has not arrived yet. Walter died when Cora was 12. He died quietly at home on a Tuesday morning in March, the same month the flood had come in 1924, though not the same day. Cora was at school. Ruth called the office and they pulled her out of 5th period math. She rode home in the neighbor's pickup truck with her book bag still on her shoulder, and she walked into the kitchen of the rented house and saw her mother sitting at the table with Walter's linen map spread out in front of her. Ruth had been looking at the map when the call came. She had not been able to fold it back up. Cora did not remember what was said in the kitchen that afternoon. She remembered the map, and she remembered the specific slant of the light across the tabletop. And she remembered that she walked out of the kitchen and put on her boots and walked the towpath to Lock 53 by herself and sat on the lock wall until it got dark, and then she walked back, and her mother did not say anything when she came in with river mud on her boots and sycamore leaves in her hair. Her mother understood. Her mother, who had no patience for the canal obsession in life, who had rolled her eyes at Walter's stories for 40 years, who had said more than once that the canal was the past and the past did not pay the electric bill, had nevertheless understood in that quiet moment that a certain kind of grief required a path rather than a conversation, and she had let her daughter have the path. Cora walked the towpath every evening after that, through middle school, through high school, through the 2 years after high school when she worked at Dr. Prentice's veterinary clinic on the west end of Hancock, through the long summer when her mother got the diagnosis, through the 3 seasons of treatment at the regional hospital in Hagerstown, through the November morning Ruth died with Cora holding her hand in a hospital room that smelled of bleach and tired flowers. Through the winter after when Cora was 19 and the rented house was sold and there was nowhere left to go but Clayton's guest room on the other side of Hancock. The walk did not change. The towpath was the same packed dirt. The canal bed was the same dry ditch lined with limestone and overgrown with sycamores. Lock 53 was the same cut stone chamber with the same closed gates and the same small stone cottage on the berm side, sealed since 1971, waiting. The walk was the one thing in her life that had held still while everything else had moved. She understood, without having the words for it yet, that Walter had built her a kind of shelter out of a dirt path and a set of stories, and that the shelter had outlasted him by a decade, and that it would probably outlast her by another one. Dr. Mabel Prentice had hired Cora at the clinic the summer she turned 17. It was a small practice, 1 vet and 2 receptionists and a kennel in the back, and Cora had been hired to answer phones and clean runs and hold dogs steady on the exam table when their owners could not. She had been there 6 weeks when Dr. Prentice pulled her aside one afternoon and asked her how she had known that the retriever in the 3rd kennel had a limp. Cora had not thought about it. He was favoring his right hind this morning at feeding. He wasn't yesterday. Dr. Prentice had looked at her for a long moment and had said, "Cora, I've been a vet for 31 years. Most people can't see a limp until the dog is 3-legged. You've got an eye. You didn't learn that here." Cora had not known then what to say. She had not understood that the eye was not something she had been born with. The eye was the thing Walter had built in her evening by evening on the towpath across 8 years of teaching a small girl how to look at a stone long enough to see what had changed since the last time she looked. Walter had not known he was building a diagnostic eye. Walter had thought he was telling canal stories. The thing about the best gifts is that the giver rarely knows what he is giving. Cora worked at the clinic for 5 years. She was 22 years old and paying Clayton and Marley $300 a month for the guest room at the east end of the house, contributing to groceries, keeping the yard driving, Clayton's old pickup on weekends. Clayton was 25. He had married Marley the previous fall. Marley was a hairdresser at the shop behind the Exxon on Main Street, and she was the kind of practical, open-faced, small-town young woman that the men of Hancock married and did not regret marrying, and she had been kind to Cora from the day she moved in. Marley announced the pregnancy on a Sunday afternoon in late February. She was careful about it. She sat Cora down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and she held Clayton's hand under the table, and she said that she and Clayton were going to have a baby in November, and that the guest room would need to become a nursery, and that she was sorry, and that she was giving Cora 3 months to find another place. Clayton looked at the tablecloth the whole time she was speaking. He did not meet his sister's eyes. He did not add anything. Cora did not argue. A baby was a baby. A guest room was a guest room. The two things could not occupy the same space. She said, "That's fine, Marley. Congratulations." She walked out the back door and stood in the driveway for a long moment and looked at the March sky and felt nothing in particular except the cold wind coming down off Tonolaway Ridge. And then 3 days later, on a Wednesday evening, when Clayton was working late at the tire shop, Cora came home from the clinic to find Marley on the phone in the kitchen. Marley was talking to her mother. Marley did not hear Cora come in. Cora stopped in the mudroom with her hand on the inside doorknob and she listened not because she wanted to, but because she heard her own name. Marley was saying that everything was set, that Cora was moving out by June, that the guest room would be the nursery, that the other bedroom, the small one across the hall, the one that had been Clayton's office, would be ready for her parents by the end of the summer, that Clayton had already agreed, that it would be so good to have everyone under one roof when the baby came. Cora stood in the mudroom with her hand on the doorknob and did not move for a long moment. She had understood walking out of the kitchen on Sunday afternoon that she was being replaced. She had accepted that. A guest room becoming a nursery was a small, ordinary reallocation of space, and she had not been angry about it. But this was different. This was not reallocation. This was erasure. Clayton had not just given her 3 months to leave. Clayton had traded her for Marley's parents. The house that had held her for 3 years had quietly rearranged itself around a family that was not hers, and she had not been consulted and she had not been told. She had been given a timeline and allowed to believe it was about a baby. She opened the mudroom door and walked through the kitchen and up the stairs without speaking. Marley looked up from the phone and said, "Oh, hi, Cora," in the bright surface voice of someone who has not realized she has been overheard. Cora did not answer. She went into the guest room and closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, and she did not cry because she had learned from her mother that tears were a currency too expensive to spend on predictable things. She counted the money in her savings account, $1,412. 3 years of $300 rent in a small Maryland town, minus a veterinary receptionist's modest expenses, minus the occasional dinner out, minus a pair of work boots she had replaced in December. She took Walter's linen map out of the inside pocket of her jacket and unfolded it on the bed beside her. Her grandfather's hand-drawn canal running in India ink from Georgetown to Cumberland, the 74 locks marked in small, neat squares, each one numbered, each one with a faint penciled annotation in Walter's careful hand. She found lock 53. Beside the small square in pencil so faint it was almost not there, Walter had written a single word. She had seen the word 1,000 times and had never thought about it. The word was mine. She sat with the map on the bed for a long time, and then she folded it back up and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket and walked down the stairs and out the back door without a word to Marley. And she walked the towpath to lock 53 in the full dark by the light of a half moon for the first time in her life. And she sat on the lock wall and looked at the small stone cottage on the berm side and thought about what her grandfather had written on the map. The following Monday, she drove Clayton's truck to Hagerstown. The Washington County Clerk's office was on the second floor of a tan brick building 2 blocks off the square, and the room smelled of floor polish and toner and the specific dry paper smell of a government office that has been in continuous operation since before the Second World War. The clerk at the surplus properties desk was a woman named Mrs. Ellery. She was in her late 50s with a gray page boy haircut and reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she had worked in that office for 31 years. Cora sat down across from her and said, "I'd like to buy the Lockmaster's house at Lock 53 on the C&O Canal." Mrs. Ellery did not move. She looked at Cora over the top of her glasses for a long moment. Then she said, "Which one, Lock 53, near Hancock, the small limestone cottage on the berm side?" Mrs. Ellery set down her pen. She took off her glasses and laid them carefully on the desk beside her keyboard, and she folded her hands on the desk in front of her, and she said, "Honey, are you sure?" "Yes, ma'am." "That building has been on our surplus list since 2011. The asking price is $10. Do you know why the asking price is $10? "No, ma'am. Because 4 people have bought it in the last 15 years, and every one of them has brought the keys back within 90 days. The first one was a retired engineer from Pittsburgh. He wanted to restore it. He got the door open, he went inside, he came out 15 minutes later and drove straight back to Pittsburgh and mailed us the keys. The second one was a young couple from Frederick. They lasted 2 weeks. The third one was a man who wanted to make it into an Airbnb. That one lasted 4 days. The fourth one was a woman from Baltimore County who said she could hear something in the walls at night, a sound like metal turning. She left the keys on our front counter and walked out without speaking to anyone. Cora did not speak. I'm not telling you this to talk you out of it, dear. I'm telling you so you know what you're looking at. There's also a gentleman, Mr. Thaddeus Ballinger, who has been trying to buy this property for 3 years. He has made the county a standing offer of $45,000. The Parks Committee has refused to sell it to him because his proposed use of the property, a private riverview retreat, does not meet the preservation covenant that runs with the deed. But he is persistent. He comes into this office once a month. He asked me last Tuesday if there had been any movement. Yes, ma'am. If you buy this property today for $10, Mr. Ballinger will be in this office tomorrow morning, and he will be angry, and he will probably contact a lawyer. I am telling you this as a courtesy. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Ellery looked at her for another long moment. Then she put her glasses back on and pulled a manila folder out of the filing cabinet behind her and set it on the desk. One more thing, Miss Whitfield. Before I process the deed, I want you to look at something. She opened the folder. Inside were perhaps 20 documents, yellowed and brittle, filed in reverse chronological order. Mrs. Ellery turned through them until she reached one near the bottom. She slid the paper across the desk. It was an application to purchase. The form was old. The ink was faded. The date at the top of the form was August the 14th, 1978. The signature at the bottom in a careful, steady carpenter's iron that Cora had last seen on a grocery list on the refrigerator of her grandmother's kitchen. The winter she was 10, said Walter J. Whitfield. Mrs. Ellery said gently. I pulled the file when you came in. I thought the name might mean something. Your grandfather applied to purchase this property in 1978. The application was denied by the Park Service. The service held the property for another 31 years before they transferred it to the county. I don't know if you knew. Cora said, no, ma'am, I didn't. Mrs. Ellery closed the folder. Some properties wait, Miss Whitfield. I don't know why they do, but they do. She stamped the deed. She handed Cora the key ring. The iron key was heavy in Cora's hand. It was older than anything she had ever owned. She drove the truck back to Hancock. She packed a duffel bag at the house without speaking to Marley. She left Clayton a note on the kitchen counter that said only, I found a place. I'll get the rest of my things next week. She walked from the little pool boat ramp up the tow path with the duffel bag on her shoulder, a mile and a half in the late April light, and the Potomac moved past on her right, and the dry canal bed ran along her left, and the sycamores stood in the afternoon sun the way they had been standing for 180 years. She came around the long, slow bend below Round Top Hill, and she stopped at the cut limestone walls of Lock 53. She put the large iron key in the lock of the oak door. The lock turned. The door swung inward with a long, dry groan, and a wedge of April light fell across a plank floor that had not seen daylight since 1971, and the smell of the building came out to meet her, the mineral cold of a sealed limestone room, the faint scent of river damp, the sweet, dusty smell of old pine sap and iron and time. And Cora stood in the doorway for a long moment and looked at the single room of the ground floor. Stone walls, a fireplace, a narrow staircase to a half-loft above, a wooden shelf above the fireplace, a pair of iron coat hooks beside the door. Everything covered in a century of dust. She set her duffel bag down on the plank floor. She took the middle key off the ring. She walked through the ground floor to the back to a narrow interior door she had not seen described on any county document, a door that opened onto 4 stone steps going down. The gate room was 8 feet square. The walls were cut limestone. The floor was cut limestone. There was a single narrow window slit at shoulder height, looking out toward the lock chamber, and enough light came through the slit in the late afternoon that Cora did not need to use the flashlight on her phone. Against the far wall, mounted on heavy iron brackets bolted into the limestone, was the wheel. It was 3 feet across, cast iron, 6 spokes, a turned wooden grip at the end of one of the spokes. The drive shaft behind it was as thick as her forearm and it disappeared into the limestone wall in the direction of the lock gates outside. The iron was dark with a century of oxidation, but the mechanism was intact. Every gear, every shaft, every bearing still in place. She stepped forward slowly and put both of her hands on the iron wheel. She did not try to turn it. She simply stood there in the cold stone room with her palms flat against the cold iron, and she thought about Gideon Reinhardt standing in the same room in February of 1919 in an ice storm opening Lock 53 for a canal boat owned by her great-grandfather, because the lockmaster of this lock did not walk out into a storm if he had an iron wheel he could turn from inside. She thought about the 18,000 boats. She thought about 42 years. And then she noticed the wall. The limestone blocks around the base of the drive shaft where the shaft entered the wall were not mortared. The rest of the wall was mortared. The rest of the wall had the gray, sandy, original 1838 mortar that Walter had taught her to recognize by fingertip when she was 6. But the 3 blocks at the base of the drive shaft, arranged in a small rectangle about 14 inches wide and 10 inches tall, were dry-laid, fitted tightly, but without mortar. Dry-laid stone is what a mason does when he wants the stones to come out. She worked the first block loose with her fingers. It took her a full minute. The second came easier. The third slid out the way a drawer slides out of a well-made cabinet. Behind the 3 blocks was a niche cut into the limestone of the wall. The niche was about 14 inches wide and 10 inches tall and perhaps 8 inches deep. Inside the niche were 3 objects. 2 brass crank handles, each about 18 inches long, with hexagonal shafts and turned wooden grips darkened almost black by decades of a man's hand oil. A heavy linen cylinder rolled tight and tied with a brown cotton string, and tucked behind the linen cylinder folded once a letter on a single sheet of heavy paper. Cora Whitfield knelt on the cold stone floor of the gate room of the Lockmaster's house at Lock 53 of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, which had not been opened since 1924, and she reached into the niche and took the letter out. The handwriting was small and careful. The hand was a German-American hand of the late 19th century, the letters leaning slightly to the right, the capitals formal, the lowercase g and y falling into graceful tails below the line. The first line of the letter said, "To whoever finds these handles, my name is Gideon Reinhardt." And above Cora Whitfield's head, 100 years of silence, and the walls of Lock 53 broke open, and the canal, which had been dead since the morning of March the 29th, 1924, lifted itself very slowly off the floor and began with a deep, tired patience to come back. She read the letter twice. She read it sitting on the cold stone floor with her back against the limestone wall and the iron wheel beside her right shoulder, and the April light coming sideways through the narrow window slit. The paper was heavier than modern paper. The ink had held 100 years without fading. The letter was not long, but it had been written slowly by a man who had understood that the sentences he was writing that morning would have to do the work of a conversation that could not happen. Gideon Reinhardt had been 62 years old on the morning of the flood. He had been the lockmaster at Lock 53 for 42 years. The water had been rising over the gate tops. He had understood, standing in that gate room on the 29th of March, 1924, that the canal company's wire from Georgetown saying operations were suspended was not a temporary notice. He had understood that the canal was finished. And so in the last quiet hour before the water came through the cottage door, he had removed the 2 brass crank handles from the hexagonal sockets on the lock posts outside, and he had carried them back through the gate room, and he had rolled his own engineering drawing of the gate mechanism into a linen cylinder, and he had written the letter, and he had sealed the 3 of them in the niche, because he had not been able to abide the thought of the canal company coming out to collect the handles as scrap iron, because the handles had been in his hands for 42 years, because the drawing was his own work and not the company's, because 18,000 boats had come through his lock, and a man does not let the tools of a life's work get melted down for scrap. The letter ended with a request. It was a request, not an instruction. Gideon Reinhardt had not been a man who gave instructions to people he had not met. Grease the main bearing in spring and in fall. Replace the drive shaft key pin every 10 years. Check the oak gate planking for rot at the waterline after each winter. The handles are yours. The drawing is yours. Turn the wheel, open the gate. Cora folded the letter and set it on the limestone floor beside her knee. She looked at the iron wheel for a long time. She did not cry. She had not cried when her mother died, and she was not going to cry in the gate room of a lockmaster's house on the first afternoon she was living in it, not because she was proud, but because tears felt like the wrong currency for the thing that was happening. Gideon Reinhardt had been dead 95 years. He had written the letter for her, not for her specifically, for whoever came. But in the practical sense of who was sitting on his floor with his letter in her hand, he had written it for her, and she understood that she owed him something better than tears. She owed him a bearing greased in spring and in fall. She owed him a drive shaft key pin replaced every 10 years. She owed him a gate opened. She stood up slowly. Her legs had gone stiff on the cold stone. She set the letter in the rolled linen drawing on the plank floor at the top of the 4 stone steps. She fitted the 3 loose blocks back into the wall the way Gideon had fitted them in 1924, dry laid tight, no mortar. She went up the 4 steps with the 2 brass crank handles in her left hand. She carried them through the ground floor of the cottage and out the oak door into the April afternoon, and she walked the 30 feet to the lock chamber, and she climbed down onto the stone wall above the downstream gate, and she looked at the hexagonal socket on the gate post. The socket was packed with 100 years of dried river silt and leaf litter and dead insect matter. She took her pocket knife and cleaned it out. It took her 20 minutes. She did not rush. She thought about her grandfather and about his father before him, and about Gideon Reinhardt cleaning the same socket in the spring of 1882 when he first took the post. When the socket was clean, she fitted the hexagonal end of the brass handle into it and set her shoulder against the wooden grip. The handle did not turn. She had not expected it to turn. The gate hinge below had not moved since the morning of the flood, and a hinge that has not moved in a century does not turn because a 22-year-old woman leans on a crank handle. She climbed back up onto the towpath. She walked back to the cottage. She went inside and stood in the middle of the plank floor, and she looked at the single room she now owned, and she understood that the work ahead of her was not going to be finished in a week or a month, and that the iron wheel and the 2 crank handles and the sealed letter in the niche were not a treasure but an inheritance. And that inheritance, as Walter had told her once on the towpath when she was 7, are things you have to earn twice. Once by receiving them, and once by being worthy of what you received. She hung the 2 brass crank handles on the iron coat hooks beside the oak door. She carried her duffel bag up the narrow staircase to the half loft. She unrolled her sleeping bag on the plank floor under the small dormer window. She sat on the sleeping bag with her back against the stone chimney, and she watched the last copper light fade out of the April sky over the Potomac, and she understood that this was now the room she lived in. It was the first night since her mother's death that Cora Whitfield had slept under a roof that was hers. The next 6 weeks were the work of the lock chamber. 100 years of silt and leaf litter and fallen sycamore branches and deer bone and muskrat burrow had filled the lock chamber at Lock 53 to a depth of roughly 3 feet at the downstream end and a 1.5 feet at the upstream end. The silt had dried to the consistency of poor concrete in the dry summers and then been soaked again by the spring rains over and over for a century, and what Cora was shoveling out was not soft river mud, but something closer to packed earth with a knuckle of limestone gravel mixed through it every 3rd shovelful. She worked in the mornings before the April sun got high. She worked in the evenings after it had dropped behind Tonolaway Ridge. In the middle of the day, she went up to the cottage and ate a cold sandwich on the ground floor and drank warm water out of the 2-gallon jug she had hauled up the towpath, and she stared at the limestone wall above the fireplace and made lists in a small notebook she had started keeping on the 2nd day. Materials, costs, tasks in order. Her shoulders hurt by the end of the first week in a way they had not hurt before. Her hands blistered and then calloused. The callous work she knew. She had learned it from Walter, who had believed and had taught her to believe that a woman with soft hands was a woman who had not yet found her work. She went into Hancock twice a week for supplies. She did not see her brother. She did not see Marley. She saw Dr. Prentice at the clinic on Tuesdays and Fridays because she had kept the receptionist job scaled back to 2 days a week, because 18 hours a week at $12 an hour was $360 pre-tax dollars a week, and $360 a week was enough to eat on and buy a gallon of gasoline for the chainsaw and buy a pound of marine-grade grease and replace a cracked shovel handle when she cracked one, which she did in the second week, swinging against a frozen clod of silt at the downstream end of the chamber. Dr. Prentice asked her the first Tuesday after she moved where she was living now. "Lock 53, Cora said, on the Lockmaster's cottage. I bought it." Dr. Prentice had been writing a chart note. She looked up slowly over the top of her half glasses. She said, "Cora, that building has been empty since before I was born." "Yes, ma'am." Dr. Prentice set down her pen. She did not ask any of the questions most people would have asked. She was not that kind of woman. She said, "Do you have heat?" "Not yet." "Do you have water?" "I'm hauling it up from the boat ramp. I'll dig a well in the fall." "Come to the house Friday night. I'll send you home with a crock pot and a winter coat and whatever else I can find that you need." Cora said, "I'm all right, Dr. Prentice." Dr. Prentice said, "I know you are Cora. That's why I'm not asking." By the middle of May, the downstream end of the chamber was cleared down to the original 1838 limestone floor. The hinge points on both gates were exposed, scraped free of dried silt, with a cold chisel out of Walter's old toolbox, which Cora had brought up from Clayton's basement the weekend after she moved in a single trip she had made without speaking to her brother. The toolbox itself had been Walter's whole working life. It was a carpenter's chest oak, ironbound, 3 feet long and 20 inches deep, with a sliding till inside and a compartmented lower section for the heavier tools. Walter had built it himself as a young man in 1941, the year before the war, the year he had been deferred from the draft for a damaged left knee he had gotten jumping off a hay wagon at 16. The chest had sat in the back of Clayton's basement since Walter died, and Clayton, who was not cruel, had never moved it and had never opened it and had never tried to claim it. It had been waiting. Cora worked out of the toolbox for the clearing of the lock. The chisels were Walter's. The 2 framing squares were Walter's. The brass-headed mallet she used to knock silt loose from the gate hinges was Walter's. Every tool in the box was a tool her grandfather had put his own hand on, and the handles were all worn down to the specific curve of his grip. And Cora's own grip was smaller than his had been, but the tools did not mind. A tool's loyalty is to the work, not to the hand. On a warm morning in late May, with the silt cleared and the hinge points scraped and the drive shaft bearings oiled for the first time in 102 years, Cora climbed down onto the wall above the downstream gate and fitted the brass crank handle into the hexagonal socket and set her shoulder against the wooden grip. She leaned. The handle did not move. She leaned harder. Her boots braced against the limestone, her arms trembling. And then somewhere deep inside the stone wall, through the drive shaft and the iron gears and the bearing, Gideon Reinhardt had last greased in the autumn of 1923, something shifted. Not much. A 1/4 inch of rotation, maybe a 1/2 inch. But the shifting made a sound. A long, low, tired iron sound that came up out of the stone wall and traveled the length of the lock chamber and echoed off the far wall and carried out over the Potomac in the May morning. And any man walking the towpath that morning, had there been any man walking the towpath that morning, which there was not, would have stopped and turned his head toward the lock, because the sound was the sound of a thing that had not made a sound for a very long time. The gate did not open that morning. It did not open for another week. But the hinge turned. The wheel inside the gate room when Cora ran back to the cottage and down the 4 steps and put her hands on it, and Lean turned with her. The drive shaft had held. Gideon's bearing had held. The mechanism, after 102 years, was coming back. She was sitting on the lock wall with her feet hanging over the empty chamber on a Thursday evening in the first week of June when the man came up the towpath. He was in his early 60s. He wore a pressed tan barn jacket and clean tan boots that had not walked a towpath before, and he carried a leather portfolio under his left arm. He walked the way a man walks who is accustomed to being met at the door. His hair was silver and combed straight back. His face was long and his mouth was narrow and careful. He stopped at the edge of the towpath about 20 feet from where Cora was sitting, and he looked at the lock, and he looked at the cottage, and he looked at her, and he said in a voice that had been educated somewhere with a long driveway, "Miss Whitfield, I presume." "Yes, sir. My name is Thaddeus Ballinger. I believe Mrs. Ellery at the Washington County Clerk's office may have mentioned me." "Yes, sir, she did." "May I join you on the wall?" "It's public land, sir." He walked the 20 feet along the towpath with a careful gait that suggested he was minding his knees, and he stopped at the wall but did not sit. He set the leather portfolio down on the limestone beside her, and he folded his hands in front of him, and he looked at the cottage on the berm side for a long moment before he spoke. "Miss Whitfield, I have admired this property for 11 years. I first walked past it on a bicycling trip with my late wife in 2015. I have tried to purchase it through various structures 6 times. I would like to offer you $45,000 for the cottage, the lock frontage, and the 3/4 acre parcel. I will pay cash. I will close within 30 days. I will not contest the preservation covenants. I will make no request of you other than that you sign the papers and walk away with a bank check." Cora did not answer. She looked at the Potomac moving past below the far gate. A wood duck came down the river in a long, low glide and landed in the shallow water below the cottage and did not notice her. Thaddeus Ballinger said, "I understand you paid $10 for this property, Miss Whitfield. $45,000 is 4,500 times what you paid. It is a life-changing offer for a young woman in your circumstances. I do not mean that unkindly. I mean it as a matter of plain economics. You are 22 years old. You are living alone in a stone cottage with no electricity and no water, and I am told no road access. You have perhaps $1,000 to your name. I am offering you a down payment on a house in Hagerstown and a reliable used car and 18 months of unhurried thinking about what you want the rest of your life to look like." Cora said, "No, sir." She did not elaborate. She had learned from her mother that the word no did not require a supporting argument from a person who had the right to say it. Ballinger did not move for a long moment. Then he said in a quieter voice, a voice with something different underneath it, "May I tell you something about my family, Miss Whitfield?" "If you'd like, sir." "My great-grandfather was a man named Edmund Ballinger. He was the Assistant General Superintendent of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal Company from 1916 until the company's final liquidation in 1938. He was the officer responsible in March of 1924 for assessing the damage to the canal after the flood and for making a recommendation to the board of directors regarding the future of commercial operations. He recommended the company cease operations permanently. The board accepted his recommendation. He also recommended, as part of the same memorandum, that the company's physical assets be systematically recovered for scrap. The 74 lockgate mechanisms in particular, which were wrought iron and brass, represented at 1924 prices approximately $400,000 of recoverable metal. The salvage order went out under my great-grandfather's signature in April of 1924. Cora looked at him now. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the cottage. "The order was never executed, Miss Whitfield. Between April of 1924 and the company's final liquidation in 1938, the company made 7 separate salvage expeditions to the canal, and every expedition returned with a report of missing hardware. The brass crank handles in particular, which were the one component of the lock mechanism that could be removed without heavy equipment, were gone from every lock post on the entire 184-mile canal. Every single one, 74 locks, 148 crank handles. Not a single one was recovered. He paused. He was still looking at the cottage. The Lockmasters took them, Miss Whitfield. Up and down the line from Georgetown to Cumberland, every Lockmaster who heard that the company was coming out for the iron took the handles off his posts and hid them. In the walls of their cottages, in root cellars, in the hollows of old trees, in the dry stones of the locks themselves. Across 184 miles, an informal conspiracy of Lockmasters, most of whom had never met one another, all of them acting independently in the last week of March and the first week of April 1924, decided that the tools of their work would not go back to the company as scrap. The company was never able to prove what had happened because none of the Lockmasters would admit to it, and the Lockmasters were scattered across 4 counties in the District of Columbia, and most of them were elderly by then, and the company decided in 1929 to stop asking. He turned his face toward Cora now. My great-grandfather died in 1941, Miss Whitfield. He died in the belief that 148 pieces of brass that were legally company property had been stolen from him by his own employees. He spent the last 13 years of his life looking for them. He drove the towpath on weekends. He wrote letters to the retired Lockmasters, the ones still living. None of them answered. He died angry. He died believing he had been swindled by people he had paid. Ballinger picked up the leather portfolio from the limestone beside Cora. My grandfather inherited the search. My father inherited it from him. I have inherited it from my father. 4 generations of Ballinger men have been looking for those crank handles, Miss Whitfield. I have located over the last 30 years the hidden handles from 9 different locks. I have them in a climate-controlled room at my house outside Potomac. I am the only person alive who knows where they are. I will tell you plainly that I do not want this cottage for a river retreat. I want this cottage because I believe, based on a letter from Gideon Reinhardt's nephew that my father found in an estate sale in 1987, that the crank handles from Lock 53 were hidden inside the gate room of this building by Gideon Reinhardt on the morning of the flood, and that they are still there. He looked at her steadily. If they are there, Miss Whitfield, they belong morally and legally to the heirs of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal Company, of which I am the sole surviving shareholder. I am prepared to be very generous with you. $45,000 for the cottage, plus an additional $10,000 for the handles if you find them before I take possession. $55,000, Miss Whitfield. That is my offer. Cora stood up from the lock wall. She did not stand abruptly. She stood the way her grandfather had taught her to stand when she had something to say that she wanted the other person to receive clearly. She said, Mr. Ballinger, your great-grandfather was a company man who wanted to turn the tools of 74 people's working lives into $400,000 of scrap metal. The Lockmasters didn't steal those handles from him. They rescued them from him. Gideon Reinhardt spent 42 years at this lock. The handles were his hands. They were not Edmund Ballinger's brass. They have never been Edmund Ballinger's brass, and they are not yours. She did not raise her voice. She said it the way her mother had said things to people at the hospital who needed to be told no. Thaddeus Ballinger looked at her for a long moment. She saw something shift behind his face, not anger exactly, something older and more careful than anger. He said very quietly, I see. He picked up the portfolio. He said, I had hoped this would be a simple transaction, Miss Whitfield. It will not be. I have resources you do not have. I have lawyers I have retained for 3 decades in anticipation of this conversation. A $10 transfer of historic property under the surplus statute is vulnerable legally in ways you may not understand. There is a provision in Maryland Code regarding nominal consideration that the county attorney has not yet had occasion to test. I will be asking him to test it beginning tomorrow morning. He turned and began to walk back up the towpath toward the road access point. He stopped about 10 feet up the path. He turned his head back over his shoulder. You are a sentimental young woman, Miss Whitfield. I am a patient old man. We will see which one wins. He walked away up the towpath and did not turn back again. Cora sat down on the lock wall. The wood duck below the cottage lifted off the water and flew in a low circle and landed again upstream. The Potomac moved past at its steady June flow. She was holding Gideon Reinhardt's letter in her right hand. She did not remember taking it out of her jacket pocket. She went inside the cottage that night and lit the propane lantern and sat at the small pine table on the ground floor and read the letter again. She was not afraid of Thaddeus Ballinger. She understood, looking at the language of his threats, that she was in exactly the kind of trouble she had expected to be in when she walked out of Mrs. Ellery's office with the iron key in her hand. A $10 sale of a 100-year-old Lockmaster's cottage on a National Register trail was always going to be challenged by someone. She had simply not known until that afternoon that the someone would be the last living man in a four-generation grudge against his own great-grandfather's employees. But she understood something else, too, as she read the letter for the third time, and this was the thing that kept her up most of the night. She was not alone in this. She had never been alone in this. Gideon Reinhardt had started the fight in 1924. 73 other Lockmasters had joined it that same month without knowing his name. The fight had gone on for 102 years without her. She had inherited a position, not started one. She lay on the sleeping bag in the half loft and watched the moonlight come in through the small dormer window. And she thought about what her grandfather had written on the map beside the square for Lock 53, and the word mine began to mean something different than it had meant the night she first read it. The hearing was scheduled for 90 days out. The county attorney's office in Hagerstown sent her a letter by certified mail in the second week of June notifying her that the Washington County Parks and Surplus Committee had received a formal challenge from an attorney representing Thaddeus P. Ballinger, alleging that the $10 transfer of parcel number 4-2847 was void for inadequate consideration under Maryland Real Property Code 9-112, and that a hearing had been scheduled before the committee for September the 14th, at which time Miss Whitfield would be required to appear with counsel if desired, and to demonstrate cause why the transfer should not be rescinded, and the property returned to county inventory for sale at assessed fair market value, which the letter noted parenthetically had been calculated at $48,600. Cora read the letter twice and put it in the cigar box on the fireplace shelf where she kept important paper. She spent the summer on the gate mechanism. By the middle of July, she had the downstream gate swinging through a full 30-degree arc. By the middle of August, 45 degrees. The iron wheel in the gate room turned under her hands with a steady resistance that was not the resistance of rust, but the resistance of a well-engineered machine operating as it was meant to operate, with friction, but without fault. She greased the main bearing at the top of the drive shaft on the 1st of August, according to Gideon's instruction. She cut a new drive shaft key pin out of a piece of cold-rolled steel she bought at the hardware store in Hancock, and she filed it down to the dimensions on Gideon's linen drawing, and she drove it into the shaft on a Saturday afternoon in mid-August with Walter's brass-headed mallet. She spent evenings reading the drawing. Gideon had been by profession a lock tender. By avocation, he had been a mechanical draftsman of the first rank. The linen drawing showed every gear and bearing and shaft and coupling in the mechanism and orthographic projection, with cross-sections and exploded views, and a maintenance schedule annotated in the margins in a tight German hand. It was the kind of drawing an engineer does for himself when he understands that nobody else is going to do it. The winter came early. The first hard freeze was on the 9th of November, 3 weeks earlier than the average. The Potomac ran a crust of ice along the slack water below Lock 53 by the middle of the month. The cottage had no insulation. Cora had installed a small cast-iron wood stove in the ground floor in September, set on a slab of limestone she had cut herself from a fallen piece of the berm. When vented up the original 1838 chimney, which she had swept and inspected with a flashlight and found to be remarkably sound. The stove kept the ground floor at about 55 degrees on a winter night with the door closed. The half-loft above ran perhaps 10 degrees colder. Cora slept in 3 layers of wool in a down bag, rated to 0, and did not wake cold except during the worst of the January storms. The worst of the January storms came on the 16th. It was a nor'easter that had been tracking up the Atlantic coast for 4 days, and that turned inland late on a Friday afternoon, and that dumped 19 inches of wet snow on the Potomac Valley between 6 o'clock that evening and 7 o'clock the next morning. The weight of the snow on a roof that had been laid with split slate in 1838 and had never been structurally reinforced cracked two of the slates above the half loft and caused a small but persistent leak that dripped for 3 days onto the plank floor beside Cora's sleeping bag before she was able to get up onto the roof and patch it with a sheet of lead flashing and a roofing hammer she borrowed from the hardware store. The slate had to be replaced. The job was a $3,000 job if she hired it out to a proper slate roofer from Frederick. She did not have $3,000. She had $641 in her savings account at the first of the year for the cost of the wood stove and the chimney inspection and 2 months of propane for cooking, and she had been saving for the well. She wanted to dig in the spring, and the well was now a luxury, and the slate was now an emergency. And she understood sitting at the pine table on a Sunday afternoon in late January with the wind coming down off Tonolaway Ridge and the snow still banked 3 feet deep on the north side of the cottage that she was perhaps 2 bad weeks away from having to call Thaddeus Ballinger. She did not call him. She sat at the pine table with a cigar box of important papers open in front of her, and she looked at the certified letter from the county attorney and the copy of the deed and her grandfather's linen map and Gideon Reinhardt's letter, and she did the simple arithmetic of her life, and she decided that she was not going to call Thaddeus Ballinger, but that she was going to have to find something in the cottage that she had not yet found, because the only thing that was going to save her in the September hearing was not going to be her grandfather's name or her own good intentions or the beautiful engineering of Gideon Reinhardt's mechanism. The only thing that was going to save her was a connection between the Whitfield family and the cottage that was older and more specific than she currently had evidence for. A connection that the county committee could see on paper. She went looking. She spent 3 weeks that winter going through every box and parcel and piece of paper that had come to her from her mother and her grandfather. Most of it was in Walter's toolbox in the ground floor of the cottage, tucked into the sliding till above the tool compartments. Receipts, pencils, old carpenter's notebooks from the 1960s and 1970s. A packet of letters from her grandmother, Esther Lee Whitfield, written to Walter during a brief separation in 1956. A Bible. A pocket knife Walter had carried since the war. She read every scrap of paper in the toolbox. None of it mentioned Lock 53 specifically. None of it connected the Whitfield family to the cottage in any way a county committee would accept as evidence. She sat on the plank floor beside the open toolbox on a cold evening in the first week of February, with the wood stove ticking beside her and the wind pressing against the oak door, and she looked at the empty bottom of the toolbox, and she thought about her grandfather's hands and the specific patient way Walter had built things, and the kind of man who in 1941 would build himself a carpenter's chest that he intended to use for 50 years. A man who built a 50-year chest did not build it with a single compartment. She lifted the tool tray out. She tipped the chest on its side. She ran her thumbnail along the inside of the bottom of the chest along the seam where the planks met the oak end. The seam was tight, tighter than any other seam in the chest. She tapped the bottom of the chest with her knuckle. The bottom sounded hollow in a way the outside did not. The false bottom came up on a hinge she had not noticed fitted so perfectly that she had to pry it with the tip of a flathead screwdriver to find the break. Walter had built it to come up from the inside, only with a small brass ring recessed into the wood. She worked the ring up with the screwdriver. The false bottom lifted on a pair of small brass hinges Walter had set flush with the grain. The compartment below was 6 inches deep in the full length of the chest. It held 3 things: a folded sheet of heavy drafting paper, roughly 24 by 30 inches, cream-colored, a little brittle at the folds; a small brown envelope, and tucked into the corner of the compartment, a ring of 3 brass keys on a plain iron loop. Cora took the folded paper out first. She carried it up to the pine table and unfolded it carefully under the propane lantern. It was an engineering drawing of the gate winding mechanism of Lock 53. It had been drawn in pencil by her grandfather on a single sheet of drafting paper. The drawing was dated in Walter's small, careful hand in the lower right corner, August 14th, 1978. It showed the iron wheel, the drive shaft, the main bearing, the gear train, the coupling to the outside gate posts, all in orthographic projection with cross-sections and dimensions. It was not identical to Gideon Reinhardt's drawing. It was Walter's own drawing, done from memory, done after the single afternoon he had been inside the gate room in the summer of 1978 when the National Park Service had opened the cottage for a preservation team, and Walter had talked his way in and had stood in that room for 22 minutes and had come home and had drawn from memory across the following 6 weeks every gear and shaft and bearing he had seen. He had drawn it for himself. He had drawn it because he could not bear having seen the mechanism not to preserve the specific geometry of it in a way that would outlast him. He had drawn it with the same private reverence, in the same private silence that had driven Gideon Reinhardt to draw the original in 1886. The two drawings Cora understood staring at Walter's drawing on the pine table with the wind pressing against the cottage door were in some deep sense the same act. Two men 92 years apart had walked into that gate room and had understood the same thing, which was that the mechanism was not documented anywhere in the canal company's records, and that if they did not draw it themselves, no one would ever know how it worked. And her grandfather had never told anyone, not Ruth, not Clayton, not Cora. She opened the brown envelope with hands that were steadier than she expected. Inside the envelope was a single photograph, black and white, 3.5 inches by 5. It had been taken on a bright summer day. It showed two men standing in front of the downstream gate of Lock 53. The older man was perhaps 80, gaunt, wearing a short-sleeved work shirt and suspenders, holding a straw hat in his hand. The younger man standing beside him was her grandfather Walter, about 58 years old, wearing a carpenter's apron and his familiar gray cloth cap. Walter's hand was on the older man's shoulder. Both of them were looking at the camera. Both of them were smiling in the restrained way men of that generation smiled for photographs. On the back of the photograph, in Walter's pencil, was written, "With Mr. Reuben Reinhardt, great-nephew of Gideon, at the Lock 17 August 1978. He came down from Cumberland. He told me the story. He said the family always knew the handles were still in there." Cora Whitfield sat at the pine table in the ground floor of the Lockmaster's cottage at Lock 53 of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal in the February of her 23rd year, with the wind coming off Tonolaway Ridge and her grandfather's engineering drawing spread out under her hands, in the photograph of her grandfather and Reuben Reinhardt lying on the drawing, and Gideon Reinhardt's letter in the cigar box on the fireplace shelf. And she understood for the first time what it had meant when her grandfather had written on the linen map in pencil so faint it was almost not there the single word "mine." It had not been a claim of ownership. It had been a promise. Walter Whitfield had known about the handles since 1978. He had known they were there. He had known who had hidden them and why. He had spent the rest of his life knowing, and he had never told his own daughter, and he had never told his granddaughter, because the knowing was not something that could be handed down in words. The knowing had to be arrived at. He had built her a path for 42 years, a towpath, a walk of 1.5 miles each way, with the Potomac on one side and the dry canal bed on the other, taken evening by evening across the years of her childhood. A walk he had known from the first summer he took her down. It would outlast him, and that would carry her back to this cottage on her own feet when she was ready to come back on her own feet. She put her head down on the pine table beside the drawing, with her forehead on her grandfather's pencil lines. And for the first time since her mother had died, Cora Whitfield cried. She cried for a long time. When she was done, she folded the drawing carefully and put it back in the false bottom of the toolbox. She put the photograph back in the brown envelope. She closed the false bottom. She set the tool tray back in place. She went to the oak door and opened it. The wind came in off the canal cold and dark and full of the river smell she had known since she was 4 years old. She stood in the doorway for a long moment and looked out at the locked chamber under the February night sky, the stone walls pale in the moonlight, the downstream gate standing half open where she had left it that afternoon. She said aloud to the lock and to the river and to the cottage and to her grandfather who had walked the towpath with her for 8 years and who had been walking it ahead of her for the 12 years since. "All right, Grandpa, I see you. I see what you were doing." She closed the door. She went back inside and she banked the wood stove and she climbed the narrow staircase to the half loft and she slept through the coldest night of the winter without waking once. And on the far side of that night, on the morning of the 12th of February, Cora Whitfield woke up with 31 days until the county hearing in Hagerstown and a plan in her head that she had not had the night before. The plan was simple in outline and hard in execution. She needed to stand in front of the Washington County Parks and Surplus Committee on the 14th of September and show them a single straight line connecting 3 men and 3 generations and 104 years of canal history. Gideon Reinhardt in 1924, Walter Whitfield in 1978, Cora Whitfield now. She needed to walk into a conference room in a county office building in Hagerstown and demonstrate in the 30 minutes the committee would give her that the Lockmaster's cottage at Lock 53 had not been sold for $10 to a random 22-year-old woman who happened to walk in off the street. It had been sold to the third person in a chain of caretakers, each of whom had been known to the one before. She needed a witness. She needed someone who could speak to the mechanical and historical uniqueness of the gate room in a way the committee could not dismiss. She had one option, and she had been thinking about him since the first week of June when she had come across a small article pinned to the bulletin board at the Canal Trust office in Williamsport. The article was 2 years old. It was from a regional preservation newsletter. It described the career of a retired United States Army Corps of Engineers colonel named Dalton Merritt, who had served 31 years in the Corps as a specialist in historic lock and dam infrastructure on the Ohio and Upper Mississippi River systems, and who had retired to a small farm outside of Chambersburg, Pennsylvania in 2018, and who had in retirement consulted on preservation projects along the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal as a pro bono advisor to the National Park Service. Cora had written down his name and the name of the farm in Chambersburg in her small notebook. She had not called him. She had not been ready to call him. She had needed something to call him about. On the morning of the 12th of February, with Walter's drawing in the false bottom of the toolbox and the photograph of her grandfather and Reuben Reinhardt in the brown envelope in her coat pocket, she walked the 1.5 miles down the towpath to the truck she had borrowed from Dr. Prentice for the week, and she drove the 45 minutes up to Chambersburg through a valley that was still silver with snow, and she pulled into the gravel driveway of a small white farmhouse with a blue tin roof at about 10 in the morning. The man who came to the door was in his early 70s. He was tall and thin and had a full head of iron gray hair, and he wore a green corduroy shirt and canvas work pants and a pair of reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He looked at her through the screen door for a moment before he opened it, and he said, "Miss." "Colonel Merritt," Cora said. "My name is Cora Whitfield. I own the Lockmaster's cottage at Lock 53 on the C&O Canal. I have in my possession a letter from the last Lockmaster dated March 29th, 1924, an original 1886 engineering drawing of the interior gate mechanism by the same Lockmaster, and a 1978 second drawing of the same mechanism made from memory by my own grandfather. I have an intact operating mechanism in the cottage gate room that I have been restoring for 10 months. I have a hearing in Hagerstown on the 14th of September. I need a witness who can speak to what is in that gate room, and I do not have anyone else to ask." Colonel Dalton Merritt stood in his doorway for a long moment. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a piece of equipment he has not seen before and is trying to decide whether it is what he thinks it is. He said, "Young lady, did you say 1886? "Yes, sir." "You have an original Reinhardt drawing?" "Yes, sir, and the letter and the crank handles." I have everything that was in the wall. He opened the screen door. Come in out of the cold. They sat in his kitchen for 3 hours. Cora laid out on his kitchen table in order Gideon Reinhardt's letter and Gideon's 1886 linen drawing, and Walter's 1978 pencil drawing, and the photograph of Walter and Reuben Reinhardt and the two brass crank handles, which she had carried up from the cottage that morning in a canvas bag. Colonel Merritt looked at each object for a long time. He did not handle the linen drawing. He asked her to unroll it on the table, and he put on a pair of white cotton gloves from a drawer beside the sink before he touched it at all. He said at one point, almost to himself, there were 17 of these interior mechanisms on the entire canal. 15 of them were destroyed in the 1924 flood. The 16th was scrapped by the Park Service in a renovation at Lock 22 in 1967 before anyone understood what they had. I was told at a conference in 2003 that the 17th at Lock 53 was sealed but probably destroyed by water damage. I was told this by the deputy superintendent of the park. I assumed it was true. He looked up at her. You are telling me that the 17th is intact and operating? Yes, sir. And you have turned the wheel. I have opened the downstream gate, sir, to 45 degrees. I am working on the full arc. I expect to have the upstream gate moving by the end of March. He took off the cotton gloves and folded them very carefully and set them on the table beside the drawing. He looked at Cora for a long moment. His eyes were wet. She had not expected that. He said quietly, Miss Whitfield, I will come to Hagerstown. I will come at my own expense. I will come with whatever documentation you need me to bring. I will stand in front of that committee, and I will tell them that what you have at Lock 53 is the most significant surviving piece of operating 19th century canal infrastructure east of the Mississippi, and that any attempt to rescind your deed and sell the property to a private collector will be, in my professional judgment, as a 31-year veteran of the Army Corps of Engineers specializing in historic lock systems, a preservation failure of national significance. He paused. I will also tell them that I will personally contact the Maryland Historical Trust, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the Smithsonian Institution's Division of Work and Industry, and the Office of the Junior Senator from Maryland on the Monday after the hearing, regardless of the outcome. I will tell the committee that in the opening minute of my testimony. Do you understand why? Yes, sir, because if they rule against me, you want them to know it will not be quiet. Colonel Merritt smiled for the first time since she had arrived. It was a small, dry smile. You have a good head on your shoulders, Miss Whitfield. Who taught you to think like that? My mother, sir. She was a home health aide. She worked 30 years for insurance companies. Ah, said Colonel Merritt. That explains it. Cora drove back to Hancock that afternoon with the drawings and the letter and the photograph on the seat beside her, wrapped again in canvas, and she walked up the towpath to the cottage in the late winter light with her breath steaming in front of her, and she understood that she had just acquired the one thing Thaddeus Ballinger could not buy and could not predict, which was a 72-year-old colonel of engineers who had been waiting without knowing he was waiting for somebody to tell him that the 17th interior mechanism on the canal was not destroyed after all. She spent the spring on the roof. She patched the slate herself. A neighbor of Dr. Prentice's, a semi-retired mason named Sylvius Kuntz, had heard about the cottage from the doctor at the end of February, and he had come down the towpath on a mild Saturday in March with his truck parked at the boat ramp and his tools in a canvas roll and a stack of salvaged slate tiles in the bed of the truck that he had been holding since a job in 2019. He looked at Cora's cracked roof for about 5 minutes and said, I've got 22 slates in the truck that'll match this. Give me your ground floor to work out of for 4 days and I won't charge you for the labor. The tiles were going to the dump. Cora said, Mr. Kuntz, I don't have the money to pay you, even if you did charge me. I know that, Mr. Kuntz said. I knew your grandfather, Miss Whitfield. Walter worked on my wife's kitchen in 1989. He did the cabinets. She died in 2017, and I still use those cabinets every day, and every morning I open the one above the sink and I think about Walter. You don't owe me a goddamn thing. Let me fix the roof. The roof was fixed in 3 days. Sylvius Kuntz did not take a penny. He took instead a cup of coffee on the morning of the fourth day, and a long look at the gate room with his hat in his hand, and on his way out he said to Cora at the oak door, "Miss, I've lived in this county my whole life, and I've walked past this building 200 times, and I never understood what was in it. Your grandfather did. I'm glad somebody in your family is back." The hearing was on the 14th of September. The conference room at the county building in Hagerstown was windowless and carpeted in dark blue, and the air conditioning was set too high, and the committee sat behind a long table on a low dais at the front of the room. There were 5 members, 3 men and 2 women, all of them local, all of them appointees, all of them in their 50s and 60s. The chair was a woman named Corinne Lovejoy, who had been the mayor of Hagerstown for 8 years in the early 2000s, and who had a reputation for patience and for asking the one question that other people had missed. Thaddeus Ballinger sat at a small table on the left side of the room with 2 attorneys in navy suits. Cora sat at a small table on the right side with Colonel Dalton Merritt beside her, and a thin leather folder in front of her containing the 1886 drawing and the 1978 drawing and the 1924 letter and the 1978 photograph sealed in archival sleeves Colonel Merritt had provided. Ballinger's lead attorney spoke first. He spoke for 23 minutes. He laid out the argument about inadequate consideration under Maryland real property. Code 9-112. He laid out his client's standing offer of $45,000. He noted with careful deference to the committee that his client had been a generous contributor to the Washington County Historical Society for 14 years. He said the word nominal 11 times. He sat down. Corinne Lovejoy turned to Cora's table. "Miss Whitfield, you may respond." Cora had prepared for 7 months. She stood up. "Madam Chair, members of the committee, my name is Cora Whitfield. I am 22 years old. I was born in Hancock. I purchased the Lockmaster's cottage at Lock 53 for $10 on the 19th of April of last year, on which date the property had been on the county surplus list for 13 years, with no other bidder prepared to take it under the preservation covenants that run with the deed." She paused. "Mr. Ballinger's attorney has used the word nominal to describe the purchase price. I would like to use a different word. The word I would like to use is appropriate. $10 was the appropriate price for a building that 4 previous buyers had walked away from, that the county had been unable to move for 13 years, and that required as of April of last year a documented 102 years of deferred maintenance. I have personally invested in the 10 months since I took possession approximately 1,900 hours of labor and approximately $11,000 of materials, the latter funded from my personal savings and from a part-time receptionist's salary. I can provide the committee with receipts." She opened her folder. "I would also like to submit for the committee's consideration 3 documents that are relevant to the question of whether this transfer was in spirit and in fact a sale of public property to a private individual for inadequate consideration, or whether it was something else." She placed the 3 archival sleeves on the table in front of her. The first document is a letter dated March 29, 1924, written by Gideon Reinhardt, who was the lockmaster at Lock 53 from 1882 until that morning, and sealed by him in a stone niche inside the gate room of the cottage on the morning of the flood that ended commercial traffic on the canal. The letter was recovered by me on the afternoon of April 19th of last year, approximately 3 hours after I took possession of the property. The letter, which I will summarize and which the committee may read in full, explains that Mr. Reinhardt removed the 2 brass crank handles of the lock mechanism from their sockets on the morning of the flood and sealed them in the wall in order to prevent them from being recovered by the canal company as scrap metal. He believed that someone would eventually find them. He hoped that person would grease the bearings and replace the drive shaft pin and open the gate. She set the second sleeve on the table. The second document is an original 1886 engineering drawing of the interior gate mechanism drawn by Mr. Reinhardt for his own use over the course of his career. Colonel Dalton Merritt, retired United States Army Corps of Engineers, will speak in a moment to the significance of this drawing. The drawing is the only known engineering record of an interior lock mechanism of this type on the entire Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. She set the third sleeve on the table. The third document is a second drawing of the same mechanism. It was drawn in pencil on August 14th, 1978. It was drawn from memory. It was drawn by my grandfather, Walter James Whitfield, who on that date had just come home from a single afternoon visit to the gate room during a Park Service preservation inspection to which he had talked his way in on the strength of his own father's having been a canal boatman who had passed through Lock 53 974 times between 1905 and 1924. My grandfather filed an application with the Park Service to purchase this cottage on August the 21st, 1978. The application was denied. Mrs. Ellery of the Washington County Clerk's Office retrieved my grandfather's application from the county archive on April the 19th of last year, which was the first time I learned of its existence. She laid a fourth object on the table, the photograph. This is a photograph of my grandfather standing beside Mr. Reuben Reinhardt, great-nephew of Gideon Reinhardt, in front of the downstream gate of Lock 53, dated August the 17th, 1978. On the back of this photograph in my grandfather's handwriting are the words, "He told me the story." He said the family always knew the handles were still in there. The conference room was quiet. Thaddeus Ballinger at his table across the aisle was sitting perfectly still. Cora did not look at him. "Madam Chair, the question before this committee is whether the transfer of this property to me for $10 was for inadequate consideration. I will submit with respect that this is the wrong question. The right question is whether this property was transferred to the right person. In 1924, a man named Gideon Reinhardt hid a pair of brass crank handles in the wall of this cottage because he believed the right person would find them. In 1978, a man named Walter Whitfield applied to purchase this cottage because he believed the right person had to hold it. In April of last year, I walked up the towpath with $10 and my grandfather's linen map and the key I had been given by Mrs. Ellery, and I opened the door and I went down into the gate room, and I found what Gideon Reinhardt had left in the wall, and I have spent every day since trying to become worthy of what he left. I did not pay $10 for this cottage. I paid the $10 and everything else I had." She sat down. Colonel Dalton Merritt stood up. He spoke for 11 minutes. He spoke about the 17 interior mechanisms on the canal and the 15 destroyed and the one scrapped in 1967 and the one at Lock 53 that the field had believed lost. He spoke about the 1886 drawing. He used the phrase preservation failure of national significance. He mentioned in the third minute of his testimony, as he had told Cora he would the Maryland Historical Trust and the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the Smithsonian's Division of Work and Industry and the Office of the Junior Senator from Maryland. He did not threaten. He simply named the organizations he would be calling on the Monday following. He named them the way a man names ships in a harbor. He sat down. Corinne Lovejoy looked at the committee. She looked at Thaddeus Ballinger. She looked at Cora. She said the committee will recess for 30 minutes. They came back in 22. Corinne Lovejoy read the ruling in a clear, unhurried voice. The transfer of parcel number 4-2847 was affirmed. The $10 consideration was deemed adequate under the Preservation Covenant exception in Maryland, Real Property Code 9-112D, which the county attorney had drawn to the committee's attention during the recess and which had not been raised in Mr. Ballinger's original petition. Further, the committee was voting that afternoon to recommend to the Maryland Historical Trust that the property be designated a state-level historic landmark, which designation, if granted, would carry with it permanent protection against any future challenge to the current ownership. The ruling was unanimous. Cora did not speak in the hallway outside the conference room. Colonel Merritt shook her hand. Mrs. Ellery, who had come up on her own time to watch the hearing, touched Cora's elbow as they passed in the corridor and said very softly, "I hope so, dear." Thaddeus Ballinger walked out of the building with his two attorneys and did not look at her. Her and Cora did not look at him. And she understood watching the back of his tan barn jacket move across the parking lot in the September afternoon that the four-generation Ballinger grudge had just ended. Not because Thaddeus had lost, because there was nowhere left for it to go. She drove back to Hancock that evening. She walked up the towpath in the dusk. She did not stop at the cottage. She went directly to the lock wall and sat down on it with her feet hanging over the empty chamber, the way Walter had sat with her on this same wall on 100 evenings of her childhood, and she watched the last light fade over the Potomac, and she did not say anything out loud. She did not need to. Walter had already heard it. The opening of the full mechanism came 6 weeks later. She had been working through September and October on the upstream gate. The upstream gate was the harder of the two. Its hinges had been longer underwater in the slack water behind the dam 6 miles up the canal that was still in place and still backing a shallow pool into the lock pit in the wet seasons, and the iron hardware had taken more damage. She had rebuilt 3 of the 4 hinge pins from rolled steel that Sylvius Kuntz had helped her cut and file in his shop over 2 long weekends. She had greased the upper bearing in September, the lower bearing in October, and she had drawn on Gideon's original drawing with a soft pencil in her own hand, a small notation in the margin, recording the dates on which she had serviced each bearing, beginning a new line in a log that had last been updated by Gideon in the autumn of 1923. On the morning of October the 28th, a clear, cold Saturday with a hard blue sky over Tonolaway Ridge, in the sycamores along the berm going gold, Cora Whitfield carried the 2 brass crank handles out of the cottage and fitted them one into the upstream gate socket and one into the downstream gate socket, and she went down into the gate room and put her hands on the iron wheel, and she leaned. The wheel turned. It turned evenly. It turned without catching. The drive shaft ran smooth in its bearings. The gears, 140 years old and freshly greased, engaged as they had been designed in the shop of an unknown iron worker in Baltimore in 1838 to engage. The coupling at the far end of the shaft, where the shaft met the gate posts through the stone wall, transmitted the rotation outward with the quiet certainty of mechanical geometry doing what mechanical geometry does. Outside the 2 gates of Lock 53, which had stood closed against the Potomac Valley for 102 years, 7 months, and 18 days, swung open in the October morning with a long, slow iron sound that carried across the water and up the ridge and into the woods on the far side of the canal, and 2 deer drinking at the river below. The lock lifted their heads and ran. Cora stood in the gate room with her hands on the wheel for a long time after the gates had reached the ends of their arcs. She did not go outside to look at the open gates. She did not need to. She had been living with the gates for 18 months, and she had been living with the wheel for 18 months. And what she wanted in that moment was to stand in the stone room Gideon Reinhardt had stood in for 42 years, with her palms against the same iron he had put his palms against, and to listen to the silence inside the cottage, which was different now. The silence had been a closed silence for a century. It was now an open silence, a silence with air moving through it, a silence that breathed. And it was while she was standing there in that open silence that she felt a stone. A small vibration had run through the gate room when the wheel turned. A settling. The kind of settling a building does when a load on its structure has been redistributed. She had noticed it. She had not thought about it. But now, standing quiet, she became aware of a small irregularity in the wall to her left, at the level of her knees, in the corner of the gate room, farthest from the drive shaft. A single limestone block set into the wall in the original 1838 course had shifted. Not much, maybe a quarter inch. The mortar along its upper seam had cracked in a thin hairline she could see in the light from the narrow window slit. She knelt down. She put her hand on the block. It was loose. She worked it out with her fingers. It took less time than the 3 blocks behind the drive shaft had taken. This block came out in about 4 minutes, and behind it, cut into the limestone of the wall, was a second niche. The second niche was larger than the first. It was perhaps 18 inches wide and 12 inches tall and a foot deep. It had been cut into the wall at the same time as the first in the original construction of the cottage. in 1838, but it had been sealed not by Gideon Reinhardt, but by the original stonemason, a man whose initials Cora understood as soon as she saw them inside the niche, roughly carved into the back wall of the niche itself were there. 3 letters, a G, an H, and a C. Gottlieb Hermann Kaspari, the German-American stonemason Walter had told her about when she was 6 years old. The man who had carved his initials into the back of a single stone in each of the 11 locks he had built between Hancock and Cumberland, where the initials could only be seen from inside the chamber when the water was drained. Cora had looked for the initials in Lock 53 every evening for 3 years of her childhood and had never found them. She had never found them because they were not in the lock chamber. They were in the gate room in a niche behind a stone that would only come loose when the mechanism was finally fully operating and the building settled, and 187 years of careful patience finally released one small stone from its seat. Inside the niche was a leather-bound book, a single book, bound in dark brown leather with a simple brass clasp and a cover worn smooth with long handling. Cora took the book out of the niche with both hands. She sat down on the stone floor of the gate room with the book in her lap. The leather was cold. The binding was tight. The clasp opened with a small, dry click under her thumb. She opened the book. The first page in the careful German-American hand she had come to know well said, "Log of Lock 53, Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, being the daily record of Gideon Reinhardt Lockmaster, commencing this 4th day of April, 1882. Cora turned the page. The second page was dated the 5th of April, 1882. 3 boats northbound, southbound. Mule teams changed at 12 noon. Weather clear. A boatman named Pettibone gave me apples for the children, though I have none." She turned another page and another. The book was full front to back. 42 years of daily entries. Every boat that had come through Lock 53 between April of 1882 and March of 1924. Every weather change, every repair Gideon had made to the hardware. Every birth, every death, every wedding, every drowning in the Potomac he had heard about, every piece of news that had come up the canal from Georgetown or down from Cumberland, every passing stranger who had stopped and spoken with him on the towpath. The private work journal of a single man at a single lock across the entire working life of the second longest canal in the United States, written in his own hand, sealed in the wall of the gate room by a stonemason 2 generations before Gideon himself was born. Cora read the first 10 pages by the light from the narrow window slit, and then she read another 20 pages, and then she closed the book carefully and held it in both hands for a long time. And she understood, sitting on the stone floor of the gate room, with the October light fading and the open gates of Lock 53 still standing in their open arcs for the first time in over a century, that what she was holding in her lap was the kind of object a national museum builds a climate-controlled case to hold. The journal that the canal historians had been assuming for 90 years could not possibly exist because no lockmaster had kept one, because lockmasters did not keep journals, because lockmasters were working men who operated gates. Except this one had. This one had written down everything. She walked up from the gate room to the ground floor with the journal in her hands, and she set it on the pine table under the propane lantern, and she sat in front of it for the rest of the evening, and she did not sleep that night. She sat at the table and read Gideon Reinhardt's journal by lamplight until the sky over the Potomac went pale with the first gray of dawn. Colonel Merritt drove down from Chambersburg the following week. He stood in the ground floor of the cottage, and he looked at the journal for a full minute before he touched it. When he finally did touch it, it was with the white cotton gloves he had brought in his coat pocket, and he turned the pages slowly, and he did not speak for a long time. And when he finally did speak, he said, "Cora, I have served 29 preservation projects. I have seen 3 objects of this caliber in my career. 3. The diary of Josiah White at the Lehigh Canal, the gate book of Captain Archibald Mackay at the Erie Canal at Lockport, and the 1837 construction ledger of the Chesapeake and Ohio from the Antietam Aqueduct Office. You have just added a 4th. He looked up at her. "The Smithsonian will want this. They will want it badly. Do you want me to call them? Yes, sir, but not yet. Give me 2 weeks. Why 2 weeks? Because I want to finish reading it first. I want to know what I'm handing over. Colonel Merritt smiled. He said, that is exactly the right answer. She read the journal for 15 days. She took careful notes in her small notebook. She marked with narrow strips of paper the passages that mentioned her great-grandfather's boat, the Esther Lee, which appeared 62 times in the log across the years between 1905 and 1924. She read the entry for the February ice storm of 1919, in which Gideon Reinhardt recorded in his tight German hand that on that morning he had opened Lock 53 from inside the gate room for a canal boat owned by a man named Claude Whitfield of Hancock. Because Mr. Whitfield's boat was the only boat moving on the canal in the storm, and because the storm was bad enough that Gideon had not wanted to stand on the towpath in the ice when there was a warm stone room and an iron wheel that would do the same work. The entry ended with a short note. Mr. Whitfield was alone on the boat. His wife is with child. He hopes if the child is a boy to bring him down the canal next spring. Cora read that entry twice. Then she turned to the logs for the following year in 1920, and she found the entry she had been, without quite knowing it, looking for. The 11th of June, 1920, Esther Lee northbound out of Georgetown. Mr. Whitfield's wife is safely delivered of a boy. Claude has named him Walter. He tells me the boy is 3 weeks old and will ride the canal with him next season. A strong name. I am glad for them. Then she turned forward 4 years to the 6th of March, 1924, 3 weeks before the flood. Esther Lee southbound headed for Georgetown with coal. Mr. Whitfield has the boy with him this trip. The boy is almost 4. He stood on the deck in a wool coat too large for him and waved to me when I opened the gate, and I waved back. He is a serious child. He watched the wheel turn from outside the window slit for a long time, as though he meant to remember it. I think he did. Cora closed the journal on the evening of the 15th day, and she sat at the pine table in the cottage with the October rain tapping on the slate roof above her, and she thought about how many times the path had to fold back on itself before a person understood that they had been walking in a circle that was actually a spiral, and that the spiral had been climbing the whole time. Walter had remembered. He had remembered all of it. The wheel in the wall and the iron sound and the serious old man in the window slit. He had remembered at 4, and he had remembered at 58 when he stood in the gate room for 22 minutes and drew the mechanism from memory. And he had remembered at 86 when he sat in his own kitchen in Hancock and told a small girl about the stone cottage at Lock 53 and taught her to look for the mortar and the grain and the initials a stonemason had carved into the back of a stone 90 years before she was born. Gideon Reinhardt had written the child's name down in a journal nobody would read for 102 years because some part of him had understood even then that the child would remember. And because some part of the path across 3 generations of Whitfield feet had understood that the walk was not about the lock at all. The walk was about the walking. She called Colonel Merritt in the morning. She handed the journal to the Smithsonian's Division of Work and Industry in a formal transfer ceremony in the ground floor of the cottage on a bright afternoon in the 3rd week of November. Colonel Merritt was there. Mrs. Ellery was there. Dr. Prentice was there. Sylvius Kuntz was there. A curator from the Smithsonian drove up from Washington in a small white van with archival cases. 2 reporters came, one from the Hagerstown paper and one from the Baltimore Sun, and a photographer from the National Trust, and the curator, who was a woman in her 60s named Dr. Rosa Hemingway, unwrapped the cotton cloth Cora had wrapped the journal in and laid it on the pine table and said to the small group standing in the limestone room, "Ladies and gentlemen, what we are about to transfer into the Smithsonian collection is, I believe, the most significant first-person account of 19th century canal labor in the United States. There are 2 important conditions to this transfer which Miss Whitfield has required and which the institution has agreed to. The first condition is that the journal will be displayed in perpetuity with a permanent acknowledgement of its finding at Lock 53 and of the 3 generations of stewardship that preserved it. The second condition is that the journal will be returned to this cottage on loan for 1 week every year on the anniversary of its finding for public viewing by visitors to the C&O Canal. Dr. Hemingway looked at Cora. Miss Whitfield, would you like to say anything? Cora stood in the doorway of the gate room with her hands in the pockets of her jacket. She looked at the small group and at the pine table and at the leather-bound book on the table and at the narrow stone steps going down behind her into the gate room where the iron wheel stood in the late November shadow. She said, Gideon Reinhardt wrote this book for 42 years without ever knowing who would read it. My grandfather walked past this cottage for 86 years without ever knowing whether someone in his family would finish what he had tried to start. I bought this building for $10 without knowing that I was inheriting any of this. I just needed a place to live. What I learned is that some plays wait. They wait for the right person, and they will wait as long as they have to. This cottage waited 95 years for me. I do not deserve what was in the wall, but I will do what Gideon asked in his letter. I will grease the bearing in spring and in fall. I will replace the drive shaft pin every 10 years. I will check the oak gate planking for rot at the waterline after each winter. I will turn the wheel. I will open the gate. And I will keep this path walkable for as long as I am able to walk it for the next person who needs it. She did not say more than that. She did not need to. Dr. Hemingway and the Smithsonian curator packed the journal into its archival case with great care. They drove it away down the towpath in the small white van. Colonel Merritt stayed for dinner. Sylvius Kuntz stayed for dinner. Mrs. Ellery stayed for dinner. They ate at the pine table with the wood stove ticking beside them, and they drank coffee and they talked about the canal until the lamp oil was low and the night had settled over the valley. Clayton came down the following Saturday with Marley and the baby. The baby was 5 months old, a boy. They had named him Walter. Clayton had called 2 days before. He had said on the phone that he wanted to bring the baby down to see the lock. Cora had said yes. He had said after a long pause on his end of the line that he was sorry that he had not known how to be sorry before that Marley had talked to her mother about it and had cried on a Wednesday in June and had told him he had traded his sister for a bedroom and that she was going to be a mother in 5 months. And what kind of mother could she be if she was a woman who let that happen, and that Clayton had sat on the porch of their house for 3 hours that night and had not been able to answer her. He said on the phone that he knew he could not undo what had been done. He asked if he could bring Walter down. Cora had said, yes, bring him down, bring him to the lock. They walked up the towpath on a bright cold afternoon in the first week of December. Clayton carried the baby in a front pack. Marley carried a basket with apples and a jar of homemade apple butter and a wool blanket. Cora met them at the oak door of the cottage, and she took the baby from Clayton's arms and she carried him out to the lock wall. The downstream gate stood open. The upstream gate stood open. The Potomac moved past below the far gate in its cold December light. Cora stood on the lock wall with the baby on her hip, and she looked at the water for a long time. Clayton stood beside her. He did not say anything. He did not need to. After a while, Cora said, Grandpa would have wanted to see this. Clayton said very quietly, yeah, he would have. Cora looked down at the baby on her hip. The baby was looking at the water. His small hand was on the front of her canvas jacket on the inside pocket over the folded linen map. He was not grasping for it. He was just touching the fabric. Cora said to the baby, Walter, that's the Potomac, and this is Lock 53. Your great-great-grandfather Claude brought your great-grandfather down this canal on a boat when he was almost 4 years old. Your great-grandfather walked this path almost every evening of my childhood. He walked it so I would know it. I am going to walk it with you when you are old enough so you will know it too. The baby did not answer. He was 5 months old. But he kept his small hand on the fabric of her jacket, and he looked at the water, and the afternoon light came low and copper across the river, and the open gates of Lock 53 stood patient in the December air, and somewhere in the walls of the cottage behind them, in the specific silence of a building that had been allowed after 102 years to breathe again, Gideon Reinhardt and Walter Whitfield or in whatever way such things are true, standing quietly and watching the fourth generation take the path. Cora Whitfield was 23 years old and the Lockmaster of Lock 53 on the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. That is the thing about the walks our grandfathers take us on. We do not know when we are 4 years old and holding an old man's large, warm hand on a packed dirt towpath along a dry canal bed that the walk itself is the lesson. We think the lesson is the stone or the story or the name of the Lockmaster, but the stone is only a way of teaching us to look. The story is only a way of teaching us to listen. The name of the Lockmaster is only a way of teaching us that a man who does his work well for 42 years is a man whose name should be said out loud by somebody somewhere long after he is gone. The lesson is the walking. The lesson is that you keep walking evening by evening, season by season, through the deaths and the moving boxes and the Sunday afternoon conversations, and the kitchen tablecloths your older brother will not look up from. You keep walking because the path does not change. The path was cut into the bank of a river in 1828 by men with hand tools, and it was walked by mules pulling coal boats for 86 years, and it was walked by a small boy named Walter at 4 years old on the deck of his father's boat. In the last winter the canal ever ran, and it was walked by that same boy as an old man holding his granddaughter's hand, and it was walked by a young woman alone for a decade after he died, and it will be walked by a boy named Walter again if she has anything to say about it for 70 or 80 years after she has finished walking it herself. A path walked enough times becomes a kind of home, a home that nobody can sell out from under you. A gate that has been closed for 100 years is still a gate, and a gate can be opened by anyone who has the handles and the drawings and the letter from the man who sealed them in the wall, and the patience to grease the bearing in the spring and in the pinion, and the willingness to lean her shoulder into the wheel when the moment comes, and the wisdom on the morning the gate finally swings open after 102 years of waiting to leave it open. Because the open gate is the point. Cora Whitfield was 22 years old and kicked out. She had $10 to her name. She spent it on an abandoned Lockmaster's cottage on the towpath of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal in the Potomac River corridor of Western Maryland. It was the best $10 she ever spent,